thing that caught my eye, or our eye, at the Embarcadero Institute was the sheer shift in size of the RENA targets from one cycle to the next. I think whenever you have such a significant jump, it always begs the question, what happened? It was one of the reasons why we investigated the 3.5 million housing number, because when you think about the fact that it represented 20% or 25% of the actual amount of housing that California has at the moment, it was such a serious increase in housing in a matter of 8 years. It didn't bear thinking that it was even possible. In fact, I think California in the past, the maximum we've ever built was just over 200,000 units a year. To reach that 3.5 million target, we would have to build more than 600,000 units a year. And it's not just a question. I think a lot of the politicians keep talking about the fact that it's local cities are standing in the way of this development, but there are other factors. There are factors like the cost of labor and the cost of land, then the market itself that come into play. So that number was completely unrealistic. And so this time when we saw that the RENA numbers had more than doubled, and in some cases in Southern California tripled, it begged the question, what has happened here? Is it the case that the Department of Finance and the Department of Housing and Community Development have been getting it wrong for like 30 years and are finally getting it right? Or have they got it wrong this time? And in the process of actually looking at this work and evaluating how they got there, I managed to speak to the chief economist at the Department of Finance and one of the economists at the Department of Housing and Community Development to understand their methodologies. So it was interesting to hear their perspective. And it seems that many of the changes that have been introduced in this latest cycle have been a result of SB 828.
Gab, could I interrupt you for just a moment?
Mm-hmm.
We're just about to hit 100 people, and some of these people will not know what RENA is, or won't know how to pronounce it. So could you tell them what RENA is and how much control it creates over cities?
Yeah, so there's a state mandated process where every 5 to 8 years, and it depends on what region, the cycle time for the major urban areas like the Bay Area and Southern California's 6 counties, and San Diego and the Sacramento region. Those regions are on an 8-year cycle. And so every 8 years, the Department of Housing and Community Development, together with the Department of Finance, looks at population projections for the next 8 years. And then they determine how much housing will be needed to comfortably house that increase in population. And then based on that, these regions are given a housing target that they then divide up between the various cities in their regions. And it's called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment.
And the nickname for Regional Housing Needs Assessment is RENA. When folks hear us say RENA, we're talking about this state rule, how much housing your city has to approve based on the state's population estimates coming up. Go ahead, Gab.
Yeah, so the issue here is that there's been a number of factors that have been introduced by SB 828, and in a number of cases, I think there has been a misunderstanding of what the process already dealt with, the factors that were already included in the existing RENA process. And SB 828 made some assumptions, some of which were wrong, and they have inadvertently created a situation where we have a doubling or tripling of the housing targets. And one of the assumptions that they made was that the RENA process, the Department of Finance and the Department of Housing and Community Development had never before taken into account existing need. And when they talk about existing need, they say, okay, so right now we have, X number of houses and Y number of people, but there's a certain level of overcrowding or cost burdening that exists in this market simply because of a shortage of housing. And if we could actually increase the amount of housing with the existing population, we would get to a healthy market. And SB 828 assumed that these departments were not actually taking that into account in the past, but in actual fact they were. The reason why SB 828, I think, didn't realize they were taking into account was that in the last cycle, the assessments were done just in the middle of the Great Recession. So what we had at the time was a very high, much higher than normal vacancy rates. And in actual fact, there wasn't this excess demand for housing that wasn't satisfied. We actually had an excess supply for a brief period of time. And so that it made the way the calculations were done, it looked like they had not factored in existing housing need. But if you go back before other cycles, you can see it's been consistently taken into account over the last 30 years. The other error that it introduced, which is really quite significant, was that it said that a healthy market has a 5% vacancy rate. And it's a well-established fact that a 5% vacancy rate in rental housing is healthy, but a 5% vacancy rate in owner-occupied housing is most definitely not healthy. In fact, even at the height of the Great Recession, with the mortgage crisis and all the foreclosures, we only reached 3%. So to be using 5% as a healthy benchmark was really a significant error. And since almost half the housing is owner occupied, that really is a significant error and needs to be addressed. And I think that though these oversights on account of SB 828 have introduced, like, these targets are not even possible when you look at the production, the level of production that would have to take place. As I said, it's not really about cities zoning that is standing in the way of this housing being produced. In fact, if you look at at our report, you'll see that all these cities are having no trouble producing their market rate housing. The zoning is most definitely allowing plenty of housing to be built. What's really going on is we are not building our affordable housing. And I think that is, for me, is the biggest issue with these numbers, because when you start to inflate numbers and almost make them up, you don't even know what the real targets are. And it shifts the focus towards market rate housing when the reality is where we are truly failing is in the affordable housing market. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we don't have any funding. The funding that from the state that used to be available for affordable housing has essentially dried up. And like cities are given these targets, but without the funding to make it happen. And the markets are not going to build affordable housing. Even this inclusionary zoning that we have in place, which is great to some extent, but it ensures that the maximum we get is something like 15 to 20% of our housing supply will be affordable. Whereas you look at the RENA targets, they have a number like 60% of our housing supply should be affordable. And so there's this other big disconnect between these targets. Not only are they inflated, but the departments are telling us that 60% of our housing should be affordable. And the reality on the ground is that all we're building is really market rate. We're building market rate in greater numbers than our target suggests we should be, but we are not building anywhere near the affordable housing that needs to be accomplished. And I think that the net result of that is almost the opposite, the antithesis of what the government really wants to happen, because ideally we want to house, we don't want to see gentrification, we don't want to see displacement, but that is what's going to happen if we keep building housing for the upper echelons of the market and continue to ignore affordable housing in these expensive, dense areas.
Gab, if I could interrupt for just a minute, I'm going to have you, if you would, start your slides pretty soon here. I just wanted to mention that we've got about 110 people and everybody is still signing in, and we really appreciate the crowd. And I just wanted to say one thing about what Gab is talking about, just to keep it in your minds. As she's noting, the state at the maximum levels when it passes a bill, and they've done 64 housing bills in the last 4 years. And that means the legislature has almost no idea what it has approved, because you got 64 bills. I'd hate to be involved in any sort of a board game involving 64 different elements. But what she was just saying is the state requires the cities to approve 60% of its housing as affordable housing. Think about that. 60% has to be somewhere between low income housing and moderate income housing, not market rate, not luxury. But all of the state laws, almost all of them, actually cause the cities to approve almost nothing but market rate housing. There's very little action under density bonus. It's a big ripoff, as you guys know, where they can build huge luxury buildings with a handful of affordable units. So there's a built-in failure for cities that they cannot fight. And we've seen nothing but attacks, except for Portantino this year, nothing but attacks from the legislature on the cities. And that narrative was created by Scott Wiener in 2016. And more legislators are jumping on because they can point fingers at the cities and not put the money back that they took away, that Gab is talking about. They took away the $1.5 billion a year from the cities in 2011, and they never put it back. Now, I'm no fan of the redevelopment agencies. I was a journalist covering them. Some of it was corrupt, a lot of it was incompetent, but they did build quite a bit of affordable housing, and there is a way to do it that works. But the governor and the legislature are not talking about that. They have not talked about it seriously since 2011. So that's my political spin on it. Gab, if you want to go ahead and start your slides.
Yeah, actually, Vic, if you could put them up, but I'll just actually add them.
Hang on one second.
Sorry.
But let me just, I don't know if you can hear me.
We can.
But okay. Just housekeeping here. Chris LeGras, people are still coming into the waiting room. And so if you can watch the participants panel and let people in as I help Gab, I won't be able to watch it. So if Chris, would you keep letting people in? Thank you.
Will do.
And then Gab, I'll share your screen now.
Okay, and I was just going to add to what Jill said about Senator Portantino, because he has, I think perhaps because he serves as a city councilor in a past life, he, I think, particularly understands the city economics. And he's been responsible for 2 fantastic bills that would have made a great difference in cities' ability to build affordable housing. One was almost recreating a vehicle a little bit like the RDAs. It was basically allowing cities to claw back a little bit of the property tax that goes to schools at the moment, and have the state backfill any shortfall in the education budget, but have the cities then have access to that property tax, but only spend it on affordable housing. That's really what is going to be required, because right now cities only get to keep about 10% of their property tax. And that's the biggest portion of their revenue. And so it doesn't leave enough over to invest in any sort of reasonable affordable housing. They're barely making ends meet. So they need some additional income stream to be able to build the affordable housing that's been mandated by the city. He also had another great bill, which was going to create some incentive for cities to use big box retail, idle sites of big box retail, and turn them into affordable housing, but create a financial incentive for cities to make that switch, because they're some of them are still hanging on because of issues with sales tax and aren't necessarily in the position to switch it over to affordable housing. They're the sort of bills that are really needed. And I think that the sooner the legislator really understands the struggles for cities to create affordable housing on their own, the better we'll be. So this is the pack. I've actually explained it at a high level already, but we'll go through it. But what my point is that this process has been going on for decades, that the Department of Finance and the Department of Housing and Community Development developed these housing goals for the cities. But it seems that SB 828 inadvertently has introduced these errors because of a misunderstanding that the existing housing needs were not already being factored in, and a misunderstanding about vacancy rates. Can we go to the next page, please? Rick? This just shows you the scale of the issue. So you can see on the left-hand side, these are the 4 major urban regions in California. These 4 areas, Greater Sacramento, San Diego, the Greater Bay Area, and the 6 SoCal counties make up 80% of the housing in California. And each of these bars represent one of those regions. As you can see, the green is the most predominant, and that is the LA counties, the 6 counties of Southern California. If you look at the third bar, which is 2013 to 2022, that is the 5th RHNA cycle. So that's the cycle that just happened before. And that's the one I was explaining happened at the time of the Great Recession. And you can see that the amount of housing during that cycle went down for that cycle. And the reason is because of the Great Recession and the increased vacancy rates. But as you can also see, this step up is extreme for the most recent 6th cycle. And I'll also point out that these housing assessments were made before COVID, and so I think they also need to be assessed in terms of what impact COVID will have on these numbers. Rick, if we can go to the next page.
Gab, before you go to the next page, could you go back one? I want to point something out to people who might not understand the colors.
The one before.
Yeah, can you
Rick?
Go back one? Who's in charge? Yeah,
Rick's
I just want to say a couple things here. Everybody take a close look at those bars. Those are what the regions were required to do during those time periods. And so if you look at the new period we're facing starting next year, they're talking about doubling anything we've ever done before. And it's simply, not only is it impossible, but as Gab will get into later, California has flat growth. California is not growing. LA is flat, San Francisco is flat, and this is before COVID. So when you see the bars, you realize, what state are they estimating here? Which state has got that many more people and that much crowding and doubling up of people living in homes together? Is that really true? And so that's the fundamental finding that Gab got to, is that this massive number that they're forcing on the cities is completely fake. It's completely false. It's just dead wrong because of SB 828. And Gab is much kinder than I am. She thinks it was inadvertent, but the bill was written by Scott Wiener. So I have my doubts that it was unintended.
We can put it on the table now.
Gab thinks it might be. So go ahead,
Yeah.
Gab, sorry, to the next slide.
So this is how we sort of tried to explain the difference between how the HED used to do it in the past and how they're doing it now, and where these errors were introduced. Now, there was some misunderstanding that this, what we've labeled at the bottom as conventional economist approach, people thought that was somehow a model that the Embarcadero Institute had built, but it's not. It's all it is on the left-hand side of the column is the current 6th cycle HCD model, and the bar beside it is showing what that number would look like if they were using the same formulas they've been using for the last 20 or 30 years. And the formula that they use is not just something that they've come up with on their own. It's also, if you look at any major economic approach to estimating housing needs, you will find that it's a very standardized approach. To look at, to have a benchmark vacancy rate, to have a replacement rate for units, and then to adjust your house rate of household formation to an optimal level. All of that is normal, standard approach to estimating housing needs. What happened in this most recent sixth cycle is that in addition to that, the HCD has added in cost burdening and overcrowding as separate factors, even though the Department of Finance had already factored those into the projected household number that they gave to the Department of Housing and Community Development. So that, in a sense, is where there's a double counting. And also the vacancy rate, as I said, was overestimated, because where they should have been using a and as they have always, in the past, used a 1.5% benchmark vacancy rate for owner-occupied housing. This time they use 5% across the board. And they also, one of the reasons why their overcrowding number is so large is that they basically said for every one overcrowded house, we need another house. They applied that thinking in the same way they would apply vacancy rate. But the way the American Community Survey measures overcrowding is they say the optimal number of people per room is 1. And they count, they're not just talking bedrooms, they're talking other rooms in the house, but they say we would like to see no more than 1 person per room as our measure. And then they look at how many houses have more than 1 person per room. So that means that, some houses could have 1.2 or 1.6. But basically this approach, if you just say for every 1 house, we need another, for every overcrowded house, we need another house, that assumes that the overcrowding in these houses is 2, which is extremely high. It's a little hard to explain, but generally speaking, most of those overcrowded homes fall in the 1 to 1.5 category. So they skew lower. So even the estimate as it is it's a double count on a double count in a way. It's not mathematically, it doesn't make sense. Anyway, looking at this, the area that has been most impacted was the 6 Southern California counties. And in fact, some of the regions, I think that in Sacramento, in San Diego, they didn't even apply the cost burdening factor to San Diego. So there's another issue, which is there's an inconsistent approach to all the different regions. And you see that in the way that Southern California, the 6 Southern California counties have been particularly impacted. And their numbers, particularly in certain cities, have tripled. Rick, if we could go to the next slide, thanks. Now, okay, this is a very, very dense slide. And I've really summed that up before. My first point is that they mistakenly assumed that the Department of Housing and Community Development had not previously taken into account existing housing need, which has been documented on multiple sites of the HCD and the Department of Finance. So that assumption was incorrect. The second bucket is the idea of this using 5% as a healthy vacancy rate for owner-occupied housing. You can see in that diagram on the right, that's showing you the annual homeowner vacancy rates for the United States since about the late 60s. It's probably hard to see, but all I can tell you, the line at the top of the graph says 5%. If you can see that line, that's the assumption the state made. In reality, those numbers have really hovered around 1.5%. You can see even at the height of the Great Recession, they just hit 3% briefly for a year or two and then recovered. But this idea that 5% is a healthy vacancy rate in owner-occupied housing is false. It would be a disaster if we had that level of vacancies in the housing market. If we can go on to the next slide, Rick. Oh, this just says like where the errors, how big the errors were and where they came from. So for the 4 regions, these mistakes led to a total of an overcounting of 941,000 units. The incorrect use of the vacancy rate is approximately 230,000 of those, that 940,000. And then the overcrowding and cost burdening is more than 700,000 of that number. One of the other things I found in the with these RENA calculations that is interesting is that when everyone is given their a portion of their housing needs and told what their target should be, they come down to numbers that 229,532 housing units. And it gives you the sense that there's this incredible accuracy associated with these numbers. But most of them are based on information from the American Community Survey. And all those measurements, because it's a survey, have a margin of error that is reasonably significant. So I personally think that those numbers should never be at that level of accuracy, because it gives people a false sense of precision. They should be rounded based on the margin of errors to the nearest 1,000. Rick, if we could go to the next one. I think, yeah, actually the one that I just showed before, I had a quote from some of the discussions that had taken place with ABAG and the HCD that clearly show that overcounting is a mistake, because it says how they have already factored in overcrowding and cost burdening into the projected number of households. But anyway, here in this slide, this is very telling as well, because this tells you what we're actually building. On the left-hand side is the permit progress for the same 4 regions in the 5th cycle. Now, the HCD has only published up until 2019. The permits have been issued in 2019. So that for a lot of these regions, we're only halfway through. But even last year, we have been tracking at the same rate. So we've actually looked at the prorated numbers, where we should be against our targets and where we are. And you can see on the left-hand graph that we are knocking the ball out of the park on market rate housing. There's no question that no one's holding back cities on market rate housing. They're knocking the ball out of the park. What they are failing to build is the very low and low income housing. They're building, actually, if you look at this number, it's 20%, less than 20% of the actual target, but it's consistent with how the tools that cities have at their disposal to build affordable housing. Because as we said, since the money has dried up from the states, and the states is no longer helping us with funding for building affordable housing, most cities have to rely on the inclusionary zoning to build affordable housing. Most of that is set at something like 15 to 20%. If you build, if you include 15 to 20% of the units of affordable housing, you get a density bonus that allows you to build more market rate housing. So it's really no surprise that that's the ratio that we're building, because that's what we've enshrined in the laws that currently exist. The unfortunate thing is there's some laws, like the most recent one, AB 2345, that wants to reduce the amount of affordable housing required to achieve the density bonus, so that it's going to send that ratio in the wrong direction. What we need is to elevate the number on the left, the amount of affordable housing that we're building, and remove this sort of slavish focus on the market rate. The market is going to take care of itself. I actually think RENA should not be in the business of setting market rate targets. The state doesn't control the market. The market operates completely independently. And they should really be thinking about how do we stimulate the affordable housing supply. And really, they've essentially abrogated responsibility for this. And have left it to cities with no money to achieve these targets, and then turn around and blame cities for not building it. It seems like a very unfortunate situation. And you can see that this hasn't just happened in the fifth cycle. The chart on the right shows you how ABAG, so this is only one because not all of these regions have kept very good records for the last 3 decades, but ABAG has. And you can see that they have consistently built more than their market rate number and consistently underperformed on affordable housing. So this is nothing new. In the middle, the fourth cycle, you can see it was affected by the Great Recession. So in that case, it only met its market rate targets, and the affordable housing was even worse off because of the Great Recession. But
yeah, could you explain the little dotted square? The typeface is too small for some of us to read. Could you describe what that little dotted square means?
Yeah, that's I was trying to say just then, but it's essentially, you can't see the line. It's basically on zero. It's basically saying that in that cycle, we built just to the level of of what we were supposed to. So we didn't overachieve on market rate. We built exactly the amount of market rate we were required, but we did worse on our affordable housing. That particular fourth cycle was very much impacted by the Great Recession. So you would expect both targets to be lower as they are. In fact, if you took out the impact of the Great Recession, what you see is a general trend. We're getting worse on building our affordable housing. And that also makes sense because since the shuttering of the redevelopment agencies, there's a lot less money to be put into affordable housing. So I think we're either going to continuing this is where we're going to be at, building 20% of our target for affordable housing, or potentially it's going to get worse if more of these bills that incentivize market rate of affordable housing are allowed to go through. Perhaps we can go to the next slide. Okay, this is actually just shows you the extent of, the reason why we're failing to build affordable is because the funding for affordable housing fell off a cliff when the RDAs closed. As Jill said, they weren't perfect vehicles. There was a lot of corruption, or there was some corruption in those RDAs, and they only had to spend 20% of the funding on affordable housing. So, of the funds that were redirected, only 20% of them had to be spent on affordable housing, but it definitely made a difference. We were producing a lot more affordable housing before the RDAs closed than we are now. And then on the right-hand side, this clearly shows you how we're building. So, we're supposed to be building 60% of our, roughly, we're supposed to be building 60% of affordable housing, and I'm including moderate, low income, very low income, and extremely low income. If we think about it just as the extremely low, very low, and low, where it's almost 1-for-1 with market rate housing. So for every one market rate house, we should be building at least one in the very low category. That's what the RENA targets tell us we're supposed to be building. What's actually happening is in the green bars, and you'll see this has been consistent. Third, fourth, and fifth cycle, we have been building more market rate housing than affordable housing. So we're building basically for every one affordable home, we're building almost 4 market rate homes. And more recently, since the shuttering of the RDA, so there's less affordable funding, and now there's also some of these new bills have reduced the amount of affordable housing required to achieve certain density bonuses. And so you see, we've actually now at the point where we're 7-1. So we are digging ourselves into a bigger and bigger hole in terms of affordable housing. And it's a serious problem because, as we all know, the socioeconomic inequality that exists in the Bay Area and around the state is bad and worse than many other states in the country, but it is only going to get worse with this sort of direction. So we're really building luxury homes, and we are failing on the mandate to build affordable housing. But that cannot be blamed on the cities because they do not have the funding. All the income tax goes to the state. Cities get to keep 10% of their property tax. They don't have an income stream to be able to build the affordable housing. They were relying on the RDAs because that was a way for them to have access to more funding outside the property taxes that they have as revenue. But without that, builders have to be paid. Those affordable housing, there's only so much you can do to incentivize affordable housing. And the way it's done now, it comes at the expense of the more luxury housing for less affordable housing. So someone has to foot the bill. And I think the state has abdicated its responsibility as far as affordable housing goes. And they're trying to blame cities, but it's very clearly a failure on their part. Can we go to the next slide? And then I think it is really important to get these numbers right. I know that everybody will say, well, a lot of people say, you can't know for sure exactly what the housing need is. It's not a science. It's, economists estimate these numbers, and that is true. But there are standard, tried and true processes that are in place that are used in cities around the world and in agencies across the country, and endorsed by places like Harvard that have a joint center that studies housing, and that their approach is the approach that the HED and Department of Finance have been using for the last 20 or 30 years. To show the difference in these approaches, I looked at, okay, what would these various models say for how much housing these 4 major regions in California had to build. So if you use what we're calling the conventional economist approach, but is actually, remember, the HCD standard tried and true method for the last 20 or 30 years. It's also the standard method that is proposed by other agencies across the country, including it's the approach that recommended by the Joint Center for Housing at Harvard University. That is 1.17 million by the end of the 6th cycle. The new HCD method, which has the double counts that were introduced by SB 828, has the number at 2.11 million. That McKinsey number, which we were talking about before, which had come up with the 3.5 million houses by 2030, their number just for the 4 regions would be 2.88 of that 3.5 million. Interestingly, if you use jobs to housing ratio as the metric, which is a number that a lot of these agencies talk about as being as an optimal jobs to housing ratio, it makes sense. Like you have to have so many jobs to afford to justify so many houses. Their number is 1.5, and that I've seen published by the HCD and by ABAC, and that says that we only would need 230,000. That's it. That number seems definitely under debate, but that is the number that suggests that the 1 to 1.5, or the 1 housing for every 1.5 job is not the right ratio, and perhaps that needs to be rethought. But actually speaking to that fact, some of these numbers, if we built for example, the amount of housing that McKinsey suggests, or even the amount of housing that is dictated by the new HCD approach, we would have to add so many more jobs than are currently in the pipeline. Jobs tend to cycle over time, and obviously we're going to be into a bit of a trough. We're coming into a bit of a trough based on COVID, so there will be fewer jobs in the next few years. But it's cyclical, but it doesn't jump in the way that we would have to jump to justify the sort of housing that they're talking about. And I think that's some of these models don't then sort of play out what it really means in reality. What does that mean in terms of how many jobs you would have to have? What does it mean in terms of infrastructure needs for that many houses? And what does it mean in terms of transit? Anyway, there's much debate. Our next report is not just taking these three models. We're also going to, we've also looked at the Freddie Mac, which has done their own analysis of the housing needs across the United States. In fact, they say that there's 3.3 million houses needed for the entire US, which completely contradicts the McKinsey number. And so we're looking at their methodology and what it would mean for, what it really means for California. We're going to look at the two professors who critiqued my work, Professor Elmendorf and Monkanen from UCLA and one from UC Davis. And we're going to look at, we've looked at their model, we've built their model for these regions and we'll compare it to that. And Spur has a model as well. So we're going to compare all these models. I will say none of them are the Embarcadero Institutes. We're not making this stuff up. These are models that have been developed either by departments, government departments, government agencies, or in this case, some university professors. But we'll show the reality of what it really means and what it means on the ground, what that would look like in terms of how many jobs you'd have to have, and how quickly you would have to build. And we'll see what makes sense. And I think that's the summary of our report today.
Is that your
Hi,
last
can I-
slide, Gab?
Yes.
Okay.
Could I have a
Thank you
question?
so much. Hang on a second, everybody. Most people are on mute, and Rick and Chris are going to handle taking the questions, I think. But I just wanted to thank Gab very much for making simple sense out of very, very complex information. And everyone should go to her site and just kind of go through all the slides. It's like a real wake-up call about what's gone on under SB 828. And it was a sleeper bill. Nobody paid much attention to it. And now it's causing this frankly, legal requirement of regions to build this much housing, and it will not happen. And when that doesn't happen, other laws kick in, most of them by Scott Wiener, that punish cities and take away their powers and put developers in charge of a lot of zoning and planning if the cities don't hit these targets. So we're not talking just about an interesting concept. We're talking about actual legal changes that completely change the power base in California.